Aloha, my name is Julie Mitchell, and I am the Executive Director here at Ikahi Mediation Center. We would like to welcome you to our Finding Solutions Growing Peace Brown Bag Lunch Series. Our Community Mediation Center is a nonprofit, and we serve East Hawaii on Hawaii Island, or the Big Island. It's the one where you see the volcano in the news if you're from afar. We were founded back in 1983, so we're 41 years old this year. We were originally a program of the Island of Hawaii YMCA, and we became our own independent nonprofit in 2006. Our mission is to empower people to come together, to talk and to listen, to explore options and to find their own best solutions. To achieve this mission, we offer mediation, facilitation, and training, like our Brown Bag series, to strengthen the ability of diverse individuals and groups to resolve interpersonal conflicts and community issues. And this Brown Bag Lunch series is held every third Thursday at 12 noon on Zoom. You do need to register on Eventbrite each time so we can get you the link and the items afterwards. Our next speaker, which I'm sticking in the chat box. Hold on while I do that. Our speaker is Dr. Deborah Goldfarb. She is from Florida. I met her at the American Bar Association's Dispute Resolution Conference last year. Her date is April 18th, and she's going to be talking on a very interesting subject that her and some of her colleagues researched called How We Meet Matters, Resolving Disputes via Chat. Should be pretty interesting. At the end of our talk today, we are going to ask you to fill out a short online survey that helps with our grant funding so we can keep this series free. So when I put the survey in the chat, please do take a moment to fill that out. You just have to click into it and then, wait, hold on. I don't think I got that through. Okay, there we go. When we put that in the chat for you, if you click through and open the survey, you can answer right then and there, which is great. We also are going to send an email out later, probably this afternoon or tomorrow. That's going to include a link to today's video, the slides that Colby's going to share, and the survey link again. So please do let us know your thoughts. I would very much like to welcome our speaker today, who is speaking on the topic of understanding and empathizing with differing conflict styles. And we have with us Dr. Colby Miyose. I hope I said that right. If not, you're going to correct me. He is a Ph.D. Holds a Ph.D. from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is an assistant professor at the University of Hilo in the Department of Communication, and also the second vice chair for the Asian Pacific American Caucus and Communication Studies Division for the National Communication Association. He has two areas of expertise, the first being media studies and identity and ideology formation. Oh, that's one topic. Sorry, let me do that again. The first being media studies and identity and ideology formation, and the second being relational communication, which I believe he's going to speak about today. So please take it away, Colby, and correct me if I pronounced your name mistakenly, and please help me give a round of Zoom welcome to our speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, you absolutely got it correct. So good. It is an honor to be here today, and I thank you all for coming. So a lot of my research focuses on mass media on one side, but the other side, relational communication. So I teach courses in like interpersonal communication or conflict resolution, or a course that I've just developed about a year ago called Dark Side Communication, which is kind of the dark tendencies that we have in relationships that we should talk about, but we don't want to talk about. And so I approach relationships with this idea of connection and how do we maintain that connection with individuals. And so when I teach my relational classes, I always like to start off with Schopenhauer's porcupine dilemma. And so I want us to imagine for a moment here that we're porcupines. Okay, we have ourselves and another porcupine. It's freezing cold, and we have no means to make a fire. And so here's the dilemma. We want to stay alive. We want to survive. And we know the only means to stay alive or to survive is warmth. And the only means for warmth itself is to get close to each other. But remember, we're porcupines. And so the means of getting close to stay alive, to survive, also is the means to get hurt by one another. And so this idea then kind of poses this kind of statement here. The ones who love us the most are virtually guaranteed to hurt us in big or small ways, even if they do so unintentionally. And so the closer a relationship gets, the higher the likelihood that there's going to be some kind of tension. And it really poses this real dilemma of conflict, especially in close relationships, is inevitable. It's inevitable. And it's not to say that conflict is a bad thing. Conflict is a good thing. It is a process through which we negotiate these two individual identities to form a singular relational identity. And so it is through the navigation of that process of conflict that it is a really positive thing that we go through. And so today, what I wanted to do is talk about how we have different approaches to conflict in terms of conflict styles. I just want to put a caveat, though, on this conflict style. So we do have a tendency to have one or two styles that we feel comfortable in, but that's not saying that that is your only style. And so the thing I tell students and everybody else about conflict styles is, yes, you have a comfortable style, but we should not make that style prescriptive. And what I mean by making that style prescriptive, it's pretty much using that style that we have that we're comfortable with as a rationale as to why we do what we do. Okay, so if all you do is avoid conflict and you say something like, what, I mean, that's what I am, like I'm an avoider. That is a prescriptive thing we give to our identity in terms of conflict style. We shouldn't do that. We should understand that we have a style that we're comfortable with, but also understand that other styles should be adopted based on the situation and context. So sometimes we should be using other styles in conflict. And that's where this idea of understanding styles and understanding other people's styles come in the process of empathizing with other people's styles as well. And so that's the caveat here. We do have a comfortable style. We tend to go with that for most situations, but we shouldn't make that our identity and who we are in terms of how we handle conflict. We should be able to ebb and flow and adapt to particular situations and use different styles depending on the conflict. With that being said, I do want to introduce us to what I call five individualistic or Western styles, and then later three what I call community-based or collectivistic styles. And I say that because these five styles that we have here, if I only left it at these five, and I say, okay, which one are you? If you are a strong community-based type of person, meaning you care more about the identity of a group, of your family, of your community, of your culture, more than the identity of the self, you're always going to go at avoiding and accommodating as your styles. And that's not you, right? There should be other styles but those two. And so if you tend to have a tendency to be more of an individualistic, more self-prioritized type of culture, then you would tend to have more competing, compromising, or collaborating as a style. And so I want to do these five individualistic styles first, and then introduce us to the more community-based styles to give us more options than just I'm avoiding or accommodating conflict because I don't want to cause any trouble, okay? And so when we look at these five styles as is, we look at it on a matrix or a grid. This matrix is from the degree of care for self to the degree of care for others. So it's on this matrix that we have here, whether or not we have high degree for self or low degree to self, whether or not we have high degree for others or low degree for others. So whether or not I like myself or whether or not I like you, that's the matrix that we're dealing with here. And so to the extent that I like you and I like myself, we'll place ourselves in one of these 5 different styles. I want to talk about the style that we don't want to talk about right now, and that's avoidance. Let's start off with the avoidance style, since a lot of us have that tendency to want to avoid conflict. We tend to think, oh, conflict, that's bad, that's messy. I don't want to do that. And so we have the tendency to say something like, no conflict, no conflict. I'm going to avoid conflict at all costs. Somebody who does have a tendency to avoid as their prioritized style, in terms of the matrix, it is a low regard for self and a low regard for others. And I say that because you're not willing to resolve conflict at all. In fact, you're just willing to have conflict be there and just stay there. And so that's why avoidance tends to be a low regard for self and others. In terms of what avoidance is, it's this following things, such as denying that conflict ever exists. So when someone says something like, hey, I think we have to talk about something, we have an issue, you hear that statement, right? Because that's the statement we never want to hear in a relationship, right? Hey, I think we need to talk. That's the one we're like, oh no, and then we start to avoid. We're like, I don't want to get into that. And so we avoid that conflict or we avoid that conversation. Other things that look like avoidance is kind of joking around about the topic. I'm like, no, what are you talking about? Nothing's going, we're good. Nothing's bad about it. Like, we're not fighting at all. It's all good. And other things would be something like just denying the fact that there's even anything happening in that relationship. This idea of, I don't know what you're talking about. I think we're doing okay in our relationship. I don't think there's any problem going on in our relationship. And so we're not even going to acknowledge that a conflict exists in the relationship. That's what avoidance tends to do. But I know we think that avoidance is a negative type of perception or conflict style. And in a lot of cases, it tends to be because we're not wanting or willing to kind of resolve conflict itself. But I will say, like with any of these conflict styles, there are advantages to avoidance. There are. For example, short-term avoidance. Okay. I don't know about you, but sometimes if I get into conflict, it gets heated. And I know that it's going to get heated. And so I will purposely, for myself, avoid that conversation, withdraw myself from that conflict for at least an hour, so that I can gain my composure, so that I can reestablish a new form of communication in that conflict, right, as we talk. And in that case, short-term avoidance is actually seen as a good and positive thing. Another example would be just upfront avoidance of the person in a relationship in general. There are particular relationships where, as much as you think more communication can help that relationship, we have to acknowledge that it's so hostile, right? It's so toxic that avoidance is the best means for that relationship. And so there are advantages and purposes for avoidance. But I will say, for the most part, in a regularly satisfied relationship, avoidance does not tend to be the conflict style that we want to have as your priority style. But there are other means to do that, or purposes for advantages of it. Some tactics. Ooh, okay. So if you are an avoider, you can connect to these things. But some tactics that we use is, again, I said about denial. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. We're not fighting. We're good. Other things would be like topic management. So when you know somebody's going to mention the conflict, you say something like, oh, yeah, you're right. There's something going on. But by the way, did you happen to pick up that thing from the grocery store the other day? And so you're really pivoting the conversation away from the actual conflict. So you're changing topics now. Other things that we tend to have are things like non-committal remarks. And so non-committal remarks would be what we call empty statements, saying something like, you know, you're right, I'm sorry, I'm going to change, I won't do it again, right? These are things to get that conflict over with, but again, you're not actually going to do these things, right? There's no commitment to actually resolving such conflict. Irreverent remarks are you using sarcasm or jokes to downplay the severity of the conflict in general as well. Something like, no, it's not really a big deal, you know? And so you're really using humor now to downplay the importance of the conflict. And one thing that a lot of avoiders do is the tactic of postponement. And so what postponement looks like is when someone comes to you and says, hey, we need to talk. It's a very important thing that we need to talk about. And this is what you do. You say, you know what? I understand. We need to talk. But hey, I got to go to work in about 30 minutes. Could you like give me some time to get ready to go, go to work? Let me go to work. Let me come back and let's talk about it. And so a few hours passes by. You come back from work, they greet you saying, oh, how are you doing today? Are you ready to talk? And then you say something like this, you know what? Yes, we definitely need to talk about this, but I'm really tired, I had a long day at work. Maybe we should, sleep sleep on it. Breakfast. Let's talk about it at breakfast. Okay. And so you see what I'm saying here? Something happens and you postpone and you postpone. And in our minds, we think by postponing conflict, they're eventually going to give up, right? They're not going to bring it up again. But in actuality, postponement of conflict actually leads to a more severe conflict because you're making them more irritated, right? You're making them think that you don't care about the actual conflict. And so that's one tactic that I see quite prominent in people who have avoidance as a tactic. Like I said, avoiding is not all negative, but at the end of the day, avoiding does suggest that you do not care about the other person if conflict does not get resolved, right? If you're always avoiding conflict, what you're pretty much communicating to the other person is we're not worth resolving anything. Okay. And so we do or should find a means to resolve it if we want a satisfactory relationship. So avoidance is like one side of this kind of extreme conflict style. The other side of extremes, if you will, in conflict style would be competing or competition. Some people call it being aggressive in terms of their conflict. As we see on the grid here, competing or aggression is low on others, so low regard for the other person, high regard for the self. And so if you're the type of person that loves to argue, you probably have a tendency to be a competitor, okay? If you're the type of person who likes to instigate conflict, you probably have a tendency to be a competitor. And so in this particular case, it's all about the self. It's all about talking about no matter what happens out of this conflict, out of this conversation that we have, I'm going to make sure that I get what I want. Okay. My goals are the priority over the group's goals. And so I will argue as much as possible to make sure that at the end of the day, I get what I want from this conversation or this kind of conflict going on there. When I pose this to students and other people, I do say, hey, there's a difference though with being aggressive and being assertive. Okay. Both are ways to advocate for the self, but one way is just a bit more hostile than the other way. So for example, being assertive is you advocating for the self without putting down the other person. Being aggressive is you advocating for the self while putting down the other person. Okay. And so being assertive is something like, hey, you know what, I acknowledge your point of view. I think it's a valid point of view, but I really want to, want to tell you about my perspective. And I want to tell you why I think my perspective is a strong perspective. Okay. And so I'm not saying anything against the other person. You're just advocating for the self. Whereas aggressive types of conflict styles would actually do something like, you know what, I really think what you're saying is dumb. Like that is so stupid, right? That is you again putting down the other person and lifting yourself up, right? When you put someone down, you then make yourself look better, right? You're putting yourself on that pedestal. And so you're advocating for the self at the expense of putting down the other person emotionally or identity-wise. So yes, be assertive, but not necessarily aggressive, right? Aggression is a hostile type of conflict style that does not think about the actions of the other person or the feelings of the other person. Some tactics for all of us who love to argue in terms of being a aggressor, if you will. Personal criticism and threats tends to be the top two types of tactics that people with a competitive style tend to adopt here. So personal criticism, hostile remarks, anything that puts down the other person in terms of their emotions and their personality or their identity tends to be an aggressor's style. The other thing, and we notice this in very unbalanced in terms of power dynamics and relationships, is the threat itself, right? You either go with what I say or something will be a consequence of that, right? Or I won't support you with this. There won't be any financial supporting for this, right? Or, I've seen it as worse as using children as a threat, right? If you care about your kids, you would do this. And so they're using finances, children, other means as a threat to tell them that you mean business, right? And a lot of times when we talk about people who have high aggression types of conflict style, their threats are not empty. That's the important thing, right? People who have high aggression types of styles tend to not use empty threats, but actual threats. Again, there are moments where being assertive is important, but being highly aggressive when we look at relationships in general tends to lead to very dissatisfied relationships and very hostile and toxic relationships when we look at that. And so those are two very kind of extreme forms of conflict styles. We have the avoider who doesn't acknowledge conflict, and we have the aggressor who says that, yes, there's conflict, but you know what? I'm going to win that conflict. And so it's very, very extreme. There's another third one that I would consider to be extreme as well, and that is accommodating. Okay, so we have avoiding, aggression, and accommodating. These three A's are the A's that can be useful at times, but in most relational conflicts does not tend to be useful. And so for accommodating, it is a low degree of self, so low self-worth, high degree for the other person. So caring for the other person quite a bit. And so when we look at accommodating as a conflict style, they tend to be very obliging, right? We call it the giving in style because a lot of times it is just giving in to that relationship. And you might be thinking about, like, why do people yield or give into a relationship? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. For instance, we talked about a collective face, right? Someone who's community oriented. We will tend to give in if we're community oriented because we do not want to put a threat on the community, right? We do not want to threaten the identity of the community, of the culture, and whatnot. That could be one reason why. Another reason why we tend to see people who have high accommodation in terms of their conflict style is the level of what we call codependency, meaning these are types of people who look at relationships and they need to be in a relationship, okay? Their self-worth is tethered to the idea of being with somebody. And in a lot of cases, love has nothing to do with this. It's not that I'm in love with this other person. It's the fact that I'm in love with being with somebody, right? So there's high levels of codependency happening here. We call that an anxious avoidant type of attachment style, meaning my self-worth is tethered to the other person and being with the other person. And so that could also be a reason why some people have high tendencies of having accommodation as their style. Another purpose of accommodation is, again, like you just don't want to get into conflict, right? And if you don't want to get into conflict, you're going to either avoid or accommodate. And sometimes it's easier to accommodate than to avoid, because by through accommodation, at least the conflict will be resolved in some way or fashion, right? You can say something like, okay, you're right. Yep, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry. And so you just give in at the expense of the self, so that conflict is just over. There are actual positive means for accommodation. For instance, if we know that it is a very low stakes conflict, right? I'll give you an example. I don't know about you, but sometimes it takes forever for me, and whether it's a partner or a group of friends, to decide like where to eat. And you're like, oh, where do you want to eat? Oh, let's go here, let's go here, let's go here. And it takes like 45 minutes to decide that. Sometimes I feel like it's not worth talking about 45 minutes about deciding where to eat. And so I'll be like, you know what? I'll go wherever you want to go. I just want to eat. And that's me accommodating. I'm just giving in. I'm like, I just don't want to waste the time anymore. Let's just eat somewhere. And so that's very low stakes. That's very, very, very small. And it's just not, you're not willing to spend any more time or energy to reconcile this conflict. You're just saying, let's just whatever you want, let's go. Okay, that's fine. That's actually a good thing, right? This idea of understanding that some conflicts you just have to negotiate, and you just have to take your responsibility the way it is. That's totally fine. And so there are some positives for accommodation. Low stakes conflicts tends to be one of the main positives of accommodation itself. But one of the major negatives is the fact that if you're over accommodating, what you're pretty much saying is that person in that relationship has all the power in terms of deciding whatever happens in that relationship. And so usually when we look at satisfactory relationships, we look at mutual responsibility in terms of tasks and shared finances. This idea of shared everything tends to be a better thing than one person having control over the other person. Those usually tend to have a better outcome for satisfactory relationships. And so some tactics that us accommodators like to do, giving up, giving in, right? Like, okay, you're right. Disengagement is an interesting one. So another way to accommodate is just not being involved in the conflict and just letting them decide for you what's going to be the result of conflict in general. Another word for disengagement, if I had more time to talk about it, is called stonewalling. This idea of like, I just don't care. Just do whatever you want, kind of attitude there. Denial of self needs is also a tactic that accommodators tend to have. This idea of, you know what, my needs don't matter. What matters is our needs, or your needs as a person. And as long as you're happy, I'm happy, that kind of thing. Which, it's great in thought, but both parties should be happy in a relationship, not just one party, right? Not just one person. And then the expression of desire for harmony. And this is the one for the more community-based people. This idea of, can't we just all get along? Let's just not fight. Okay, let's just not. Okay, that's the idea of expression of harmony in this type of community-based conflict resolution for accommodators. How we doing? So far, so good? Okay. All right. Okay, now we're getting into some positive types of conflict styles that we tend to like. The next one is, we're going to go to the middle ground, compromise. So compromise is medium degree for self, medium degree for others. That means, like, if we think about it as a business transaction, it is a give and take, right? I will give some to get something out of it. I'm also willing to give up some in order for that you get something out of it. And so it is a win some, lose some type of situation as a business transaction. You're not going to get fully what you wanted, but you'll get something out of it. You're also going to not get what you don't want. Okay, so you get some, you lose some. In a compromise, what it matters in a compromise is equality, an equal trade-off. So if I decide to do this in a relationship, you decide to do that, it's equal. It's a fair exchange, okay? So let's go back to this idea of like where to eat. Let's say you're in a romantic relationship and you have to decide where you want to eat, and you don't want to spend 45 minutes deciphering where you want to eat. A good compromise would be something like, hey, I'll let you decide what you want to eat today. The next time, it's my turn. And so you just go back and forth. You go back and forth. Same thing for like some relationships decide on like how to pay for food, right? Instead of, one person paying for everything, you go back and forth. Like, it's my turn, it's your turn, it's my turn. That's a compromise. And what I mean that it's a compromise is today I might not get what I want in terms of what I want to eat, and you will. But next time I'll get what I want and you probably won't, right? And so I'm fine with that, right? It's an equal, fair negotiation that's happening between two individuals in that relationship. And so when we tend to think about compromise and equality in a relationship, a lot of the tactics that we tend to have are, again, fairness, equal trade-off. And this is the important one: maximizing what you want and minimizing the losses that you give up. And so you will give up some stuff, but you want to make sure that you still have the integrity of getting the maximum of what you want in that relationship or in that conflict. What we like about compromise, because I know a lot of people are like, why is compromise good? I thought collaboration would be like the one you want, right? It's the best one. And you're right. But compromise is so good because it saves so much time. Okay. Whenever there's high stakes types of conflict, right? Conflict surrounding this idea of big transitions or big moments, collaboration is probably the best way to go, because you want to make sure that both people in that relationship get the maximum of what they want. But when it's low stakes, such as deciding when, where to eat, or who should pay on what day, do you really want to spend that much time and energy collaborating on both parties getting the maximum of what they want? Or should we just give in sometimes, give and take, and then, kind of move on with our relationship? And I would go with the latter, right? I don't want to spend 2 hours figuring out who should pay tonight for dinner. I just want to compromise. And so low stakes, we tend to like to compromise. We still get, a lot of what we want, and we're willing to give up a little bit. But when it is high stakes, when it is of the utmost importance in your relationship, collaboration tends to be the thing that we want to aim for. And so collaboration, when we look at the grid itself, it is a high degree for self, a high degree for others, meaning I absolutely want to make sure that the other person gets everything that they want. But at the same time, I want to get everything that I want as well. And so a lot of the ideas of collaboration is this idea of communication, extensive communication and negotiation in whatever relationship you're in. I'll give you an example. Like, there's some things that you absolutely really shouldn't be compromising with, and these are big values that a relationship has. For instance, this idea of whether or not you want kids, right? Like, let's say somebody does not want kids and somebody does want kids. Are you going to compromise on that? I don't think so. That's a big value that needs more collaboration than compromise, right? Or this idea of the belief of marriage versus not getting married, right? These are two separate big ideological beliefs that you can't compromise on. And so collaboration is needed for something like that. And so when it's something that is of large value, of large transition, such as should we move in together, we probably should take the time to talk about the boundaries and negotiate what that looks like in that relationship. And so for those kinds of things, collaboration probably is the best way to go. It's the hardest thing to do. It is time consuming, but if it's something so big like those things, it's absolutely worth it. And so the time that it takes to collaborate is worth it for these particular situations. What we notice about collaborators is they do two things, two types of remarks: analytical remarks and conciliatory remarks. Analytical remarks is about the actual thing that's being said about in terms of conversation. So an analytical remark could be something like, you know what you said, I really value what you say. I think it's a really good idea that you mentioned this, and this. Thank you so much for putting the time and effort for doing that. You are now, again, giving a remark on what's being said, the content of what's being said. Conciliatory remarks is you now giving value to the person, not the content now, but to the person, the personality of the person. So something like, I really appreciate, the type of emotion investment that you're putting into this relationship. I really appreciate the way you said what you said, and the tone that you use. I feel like that tone that you use in general really helped to kind of de-escalate the situation, and it really helped me to connect to what you're saying. And so you're really talking about the personality, the identity of the person. You put these two together, right? Remarks on the statement or the content, remarks on the person, and that really makes a very conducive environment to have a very good conversation for collaboration. And so, yeah. And so the high spectrum idea of what we want would be collaboration. When we don't have the time and it's not a high stakes thing, compromising tends to be a better solution. Aggression, avoiding, and accommodating, although has positive uses in some areas, that sometimes might be something we reevaluate in terms of our use of these particular conflict styles. And so these are the five kind of individualistic, individual prioritized styles. Are we okay so far? Yeah. Okay, let me muddy some waters for you. Okay, so I did say, if you are a strong community-centered type of person, meaning you care for the community more than anything else, avoiding and accommodating would be the only two styles you can do in these five. And so what do I mean by strongly community-based or cultural-based? We call that being a collectivistic kind of person. So someone who cares about the collective more than the self, okay? I'll give you an example. This is a very Hawaii and somewhat East Asian kind of thing, but your family will always tell you this, okay? Whatever you do, no shame. Don't bring shame to us, okay? And so that word, don't bring shame to us, means that the collective group is more important than what you do as an individual, okay? And so what you do as an individual speaks to the collective group. So it's a reflection of the group in general, okay? So don't bring shame, right? Or when in Hawaii, at least, even if you don't want to go to a party, you have to go to the party because they say this, because you got to show face. You got to show face. You got to show up. You got to show that you're supportive in this community, in this culture. And so the community then becomes very important over the self. That makes sense now to us, right? If we care more about the community and the culture, then of course we're going to avoid conflict because we don't want to make the community look bad. Or of course we're going to accommodate because we don't want to call out people's faces. We don't want to call out people's identity in the community. That's bad for all of us collectively. And so there's a scholar, her name is Stella Tuntimi, and she came up with this theory called face and politeness theory. But she also noticed this. She said, hey, we are more than just avoiders and accommodators. We do care about, asserting for ourselves, but we do so in a way that tries not to, at least directly, call out the identity or the face of the other person in conflict. And so she comes up with 3 more conflict styles that these collectivistic, culture-focused types of communities tend to use. Neglect, or a lot of us call neglect passive aggression, emotional expression, third-party involvement. As we notice, by adding these three things, we now push the other things further along the matrix, and now third-party involvement is the compromise, right? It's the middle ground. Neglect is more regard for the other, but still asserting for the self. And emotional expression is, again, regard for the other, regard for the self at a middle ground, okay? Again, we're not directly calling out the other person. We're not saying, hey, we have conflict and we need to do something about it. We're going to do these things in a different way. Okay, so let me explain these three styles, because I know a lot of us now are like, that's my style. I'm not an avoider. I'm not an accommodator. I'm one of these three things. The first one is emotional expression. Okay, and so emotional expression is, again, you caring to assert for the self, but you also not wanting to call out the other person. And so I will not directly tell you that there's problems, but through my nonverbals, you will know that there are problems, okay? For example, if someone asks me, how are you doing today? And I say something like, I'm okay. Obviously, if we only take it at face value in just the words, I'm okay, suggests that I'm okay. But the fact that I went, I'm okay, the tone then emotionally expresses that I'm not okay. Okay. Same thing for something like, how are you doing today? And you say something like, I'm fine. I'm fine. If we take that at face value, I'm fine means I'm fine. But when we add tone and nonverbal expression and we do something like, I'm fine, that tone, that emotional expression then suggests to you that something is wrong between the two of us. I'm not directly calling you out, but something's going on between the two of us, and we need to find a means to compromise or to kind of resolve that conflict. And so we use emotion and nonverbals as a means to show you that something's going on in that relationship, that we're not fine, that we're not okay. And it's because, again, we cannot actually directly tell you how we feel. Another way we do emotional expression, we call this triangulation, is when we talk about you through something else. Okay. So for instance, triangulation could be something like, let's say I did a really good job at a baseball game, and maybe my father wants to tell me that I did a good job at a baseball game. He's not going to directly come to me and say, hey, I think you did a really good job at the baseball game. That's not a collectivistic thing. That's not a community thing. So you know how he's going to do that? He's going to look to, let's say we have a dog. He's going to look at the dog, going to make sure that I'm in the room, and he's going to be like, you know what, so-and-so, I think Colby did a good job at the game. He's so good. Good. And so that's him talking to the dog, hoping that I'm listening to him, saying that I did a good job. So that's triangulation right there. Or it's when you're talking to your friend about myself. So let's say my dad's out talking about me and I'm with them. One way to say that I'm proud of you, instead of directly telling me that I'm proud of me, is through his friend saying something like, yeah, my son went to school, he worked hard, he worked really hard for that. And so by doing that, he's not directly telling me that he's proud of me, but he is telling me that he's proud of me through triangulation. And so again, we're not direct in this particular case, but we do use emotional and nonverbal stuff to show how we feel. The other thing, which is what a lot of us do, passive aggression. Okay, this is okay. So what does passive aggression look like? Well, it takes emotional expression, right? But it also takes action now and behavior. Okay, so let me give you a scenario. Let's say we're roommates, okay? And your job was to wash the dishes, or maybe we all agreed that everybody takes care of their own dishes, okay? I come home, I see dishes in the sink. What do I do? Nothing at first. I do absolutely nothing at first. I let it go. Okay. Let's say a couple days pass by. There's more dishes in the sink. Okay. What do? I wait till you get into the kitchen as well. And I say something like, huh, it's a lot of dishes. Then I leave. That's it. Right. Very, very minor. Okay. Let's say a few more days go by, more dishes, like it's piling up. I'm gonna wait for you to come to the kitchen, and while you're in the kitchen, I'm gonna be like, "Wow, what is that smell? It really is that the dishes? Okay," and I'm gonna walk away. Okay, it's gonna build up to a point that my passive aggression is going to come to action, and that point where there's so many dishes in the sink, I'm gonna wait until you get into the kitchen and I'm going to do the dishes myself. Okay. I'm going to do the dishes myself, but I'm not going to be smiling when I do the dishes, right? I am going to be slamming stuff. Okay. And then this is what you're going to do. You're going to come up to me and say something like, those are my dishes. Do you want me to do it? And I'm going to say, no, I got it. Don't worry about it. I got it. Did I tell you that's your fault? No, I got it. Don't worry about it. But I didn't directly tell you that you need to take care of your dishes. But I did tell you, you better take care of your dishes next time. That's what passive aggression looks like. And so I'm not calling you out, but I sure hope you pick up that next time you really need to do what your responsibilities are. And so it starts slow, brings its way up. Okay. And so that's what passive aggression tends to be in these particular cases. And we hope that the other person picks up on that. The third one is third-party help. This is the help of mediation centers like this one, in terms of bringing a third party so that you don't confront the other person. And so what we find a lot is businesses, especially East Asian businesses, instead of being in the same room together to negotiate terms, they usually stay in two separate rooms and have a third party person go back and forth to negotiate the terms for them. And they do that because they don't want to directly cause conflict or call each other out. They want to make sure that they're still on good standings as they negotiate the terms that they want. And so they use a third party to do that. We see a lot of that happening right after the pandemic in terms of like landowner, tenant types of disputes. A lot of times, especially in collectivistic community-based types of communities, they tend to go to third-party types of places so that it doesn't get heated, right? They don't call each other out, but they do negotiate to find some means so that both can collaborate or work with each other in terms of payment of rent and whatnot. And so third party tends to be a very, very good, I would say, a good alternative to compromise if you are wanting to, again, keep your relationship intact and not call out the other person in the relationship. And so I highly advise third party types of conflict resolution, especially if you care about, like, again, community-based, community-faced cultural types of situations here. So let me wrap this up. Like, why talk about 8 different communication styles? Well, the idea is not to, again, use these styles as a defensive mechanism, saying, oh, that's just me, that's who I am. The idea is to understand that we all have different styles and we all use different styles at different contexts and different situations. Some styles might not be important in the moment or might not be useful in the moment. And it's really your understanding of these styles in terms of when you should use it and when you shouldn't use it that really brings up a very kind of conducive and progressive type of conflict resolution. It's also important to understand the other person, and that's where the empathizing comes in, to understand that some people might approach conflict in a particular way. And if that's the case, it's not your job to combat that style. It's your job to really work with that style, right? And to adapt so that, both parties have that level of compromise, third-party agreement, or collaboration more than just one person getting everything out of a conflict. And so it's really about understanding yours and others, but adapting as a means to empathize with other people's styles. With that said, I think I'm good to go. So I'm happy
Okay,
to.
Colby. Oh, sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
no, no. I was gonna say I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, we have some interesting ones in the chat. So one person saying so true about no shame us and showing face being Hawaii cultural expectations of grandparents, parents, and boomer generations. It seems like the generations under the boomers, aka Gen X, Y, and Z, may not hold these same values and expectations. Is that something you've noticed? How does the way a boomer negotiates conflict with a Gen Z different from others with the same generational expectations and values? What works best?
Okay, this is a really good question, and the answer is yes. There are definite generational differences. Um, Not just generational, but I would also say cultural differences. So what we notice is more westernized nations tend to develop more individualistic types of tendencies. So like self-prioritized conflict styles or self-prioritized behaviors, whereas more kind of like East Asian, South American types of cultures tend to have more collectivistic types of tendencies. But it's changing generationally, because what we're noticing, and I'll give an example of like South Korea or Japan, a lot of a younger generation is tending to adopt more westernized ideologies of what is, conflict, what is relationship and whatnot. And because of that, they are becoming a bit more individualized in terms of their conflict style. And so the no shame mentality is slowly disappearing to create this idea of, okay, what do I need? Like, what do I want? So we do see more, aggression, hopefully assertiveness, but more aggression as a leading cause of that.
Thank you, Colby. Another question is, I'd like to hear more about solutions for when styles are getting in the way of resolutions.
Okay, solutions of when styles are getting in the way of resolutions. Well, again, I think the goal is not to prescribe yourself to a style, right? To understand that you may have a style that you're most comfortable with, but it's best that both parties in a relationship understand that they both need to adapt given the context of the situation of what best style to use. And so let's not say that style should get in the way. Let's say that style should be the thing that helps us resolve conflict. And so using the right style, not your comfortable style, the right style in that given context is probably more of a thing that we should adopt than again, using the style that I'm comfortable with. But thank you. Good question.
Trying to scan through here. There's a lot of comments versus actual questions. We will be sending this whole slides out. Somebody was saying I'd like to see a copy of it. Okay, here we go. Here's another one. What are some techniques to use when somebody clearly comes from a very different conflict style? For example, is aggressive and projecting.
Okay. Well, that's difficult. And again, it depends on what kind of relationship you're in. Like if you're in a close romantic relationship, I'm very interested in how that works out. Because usually when we talk about relationships in general, there's two terms that we use in terms of how people come together, and that's like heterogamy, which means is like oppositions attract, and homogamy, which is like similarities attract. And it sounds a little bit like heterogamy to me, like two opposites things kind of colliding with each other. And a lot of times relationships, I'm saying a lot of times because I'm not saying it can't happen, but a lot of times this idea of strong differences don't tend to make a relationship past 5 years. I'm not saying that differences is a bad thing. Differences is a good thing if it's very small, right? But if it's very large, like values, it doesn't tend to be good for a relationship because it's very hard to collaborate or compromise on like strong differences or values in a relationship. And so you can try to adapt your style, but then again, I will say this, at the end of the day, sometimes some relationships are so hostile that you need to decide when it's best to walk away.
Okay, let's see if we have anything else. Okay, there's a lot of thank yous and more comments. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to hear from Colby on? You can either put it in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself. We have probably time for one more question. When are you writing your book? Someone's asking. I don't know who iPhone is, but somebody's, when are you writing your book?
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, I am working on a book, but it's not on just conflict style per se. It's about like relationships in general, but conflicts have something to do with that. But hopefully within the next couple of years, a book gets released. But yeah, thanks.
That must be somebody who knows you and is familiar with you. Any other last minute questions for you folks? That was not a long answer one. If anybody else wants to unmute, raise your hand. Put something in the chat. Okay, here we go. Ari, different styles. Is this a conversation we have? I see. This is a mediator. Okay, so this is a mediator specific question saying, when we're having a conversation with the mediation participants, do we have a conversation with the people, or is this something mediators just think about and adjust in the background? Like, are you calling someone out for their style? I think is almost what it's saying.
Yeah, I don't think it would be conducive to the conversation to just call out somebody on their style. But it might be great to bring up a conversation to say something like, hey, we all approach conflict in different ways. Do you mind having a conversation about the different ways we might approach conflict? And maybe they can see themselves in one of those styles. But I necessarily don't think like saying, hey, you're avoiding, don't do that will help the situation.
Another question is asking what kind of books you recommend. And frankly, that one is, if you have any books you recommend, if you want to email them to me, I can include them with the email that I send to others. So that way we don't have to have a huge, long discussion here about that. Maybe you could give me a list and I could include it with that email.
Yeah, happy to do so.
And then I've got a couple others. Let's go to Lori, who's actually a live question versus a chat question. I think this will probably have to be the last one. Go ahead, Lori.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it'd be easier than typing. I'm thinking about a situation in which maybe there's a mediation happening, and we've had a session individually with each person, and we get the sense that I'm thinking mostly about the avoidance style. As the mediator, you get the sense that one of the parties is just literally not able to bring their whole selves, like represent themselves, because they're so abstract and guarded and avoidant and like just not willing to even acknowledge their own feelings or thoughts about something. I guess you would call that like extremely avoidant. I'm just wondering about thoughts. Like if I mean, my instinct would be this might not be a good situation for mediation, for a facilitated conversation.
Yeah, initially, I don't think it might be a good situation for mediation because it kind of sounds like this person just has a difficulty, and it could be unconscious or consciously, to the ability to express themselves in general, right? And so we call that normative alexithymia, right? The idea that we aren't able to express how we're feeling through words or emotions. And that's something that needs to be worked on individually before actually going to mediation, because if someone's not even available to express themselves or don't know how to express themselves, you're probably going to have to work at how to do that first before going through mediation. Yeah.
Can you tell me that word again?
Normative alexithymia, AlexithymiA, I think, alexithymia.
Alexithymia. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting talk, Colby. Thank you so much. And very lots of other comments, wanting to know are certain types of healthier than the others, when is being passive aggressive helpful in a conflict, and also, yeah. In any case, we could have a much longer discussion on this. You could go back to school and go
I was gonna say,
take one of
you can take the
Colby's
classes.
classes. Thank you all for being so engaged, for sticking with us. Please do take a few minutes to fill out the online survey. Again, it helps with our grant funding for our free series here today. Thanks for taking an hour out of your busy days to be here. Do check your emails either today or tomorrow for the slides and the recording if you want to watch it again. It'll have the survey list link if sometimes people say they have a hard time clicking it in the chat box. Please give me please join me in giving a warm appreciation for Colby's being here today. And hope to see you all next month for our next Brown Bag talk with Dr. Deborah Goldfarb on how we meet matters, resolving disputes via chat. Take care. Aloha.